Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the noontime show today. Obviously a lot of focus on Hurricane Florence as all eyes are on the Carolinas. I want to thank Maria LaRosa from the Weather Channel for Skyping in. Now we get the environmental and public policy perspective. Chad McGuire is a professor of public policy with a focus on environmental policy at UMass Dartmouth. Chad, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we just got the weather forecast, and I'm glad that we can have you join us because really want to sort of talk about the public policy side of things, both from preparing for hurricanes and their aftermath. So introduce yourself to viewers a little bit, Chad, and tell us a little bit about your hurricane research, and then we'll go on about this hurricane and more.
Yeah, so my research really looks at the intersection of what government does before things like natural disasters like hurricanes happen, what they do to help prepare us both in terms of dealing with the actual event and maybe even preparing us so that we avoid some of the worst consequences of those events. So my research looks at that, what government does beforehand, during, and then after these events. So I kind of look at it in a time perspective, and I focus very much on what government, the actions government actually takes in terms of its planning, but also some of the laws that we have in place. I have a legal background, so I look at those laws and I see how those laws interact with some of the policies. And sometimes they interact quite well, they run parallel to each other, and sometimes they're somewhat contradictory in how they play out.
So talk with a little bit about that. What are some of these contradictions that you've seen?
So, I mean, generally speaking, and it makes sense if you think about it, we as a society don't want most of our society living in dangerous areas. A silly example is I don't think anybody is interested at living on the edge, the very top of an active volcano, right? I don't think anybody wants to have their property located there. Mm-hmm. Because it's dangerous, it's active, and it's obvious. There's real immediate danger. You know, as we as a society historically, and we live here in New England, you know, a lot of the development that happened in New England is a direct consequence of how we settled this area of the country. You know, we came on boats, we got to the coastline, and we started living in those
just set up shop right on the water.
Right, and we know that. We see that in Boston and, you know, so on and so forth. And, you know, a lot of people don't realize, and certainly in Providence and many other areas along the eastern seaboard. And because of that, you know, we sort of had this historical dependence. You know, we didn't start living on top of volcanoes, that's obvious, right? But we started living in these coastal areas, and most of these areas are very low-lying. As a matter of fact, if you look at a very old map of Boston, you'll see that what actually we see Boston today is about 50 to 60% of it is fill.
Yes.
This area that used to be water, and we've actually filled it. Like Back Bay, for example, is called Back Bay for a good reason, because it used to be a bay.
Yes.
And the only reason I say that is because if we think about it, we live very close to the water. We don't live up high like you think of the cliffs of Dover in England, for example, right? You know, where you're thinking that, you know, you live very far above. You're very close to the water, but you live very far above it. Here we live very close to the water. And, of course, we know in New England, nor'easters, we have special conditions here that allow for these types of storms to sort of sit on us, not unlike what's happening right now down in North and South Carolina, sort of sit along the coastline, re-energize themselves and put a lot of energy, you know, re-energize in the ocean, get some more energy from the water, the warmth in the water itself, moisture, and then be able to deposit that on the land, which makes it especially, relatively speaking, dangerous. So, you know, what I'm saying is that we sort of have historically decided to live in areas that have some degree of inherent danger. If we add on top of that this idea of climate change and this notion of, you know, our sea levels are increasing, and this has been shown, right, where we're actually in our area of the Atlantic, we're, you know, increasing at a rate that's about as high as we've seen globally. So with the increase in sea level rise, even though it's not significant on an annual basis or even a decadal basis, it's not a lot of sea level rise. It is not in the terms of like a foot of sea level rise in the sort of near term. It has the capacity to really move that water over this very low-lying land, very far inland, and cause substantial damage when you couple the idea of an increasing sea level with increasing intensity and frequency of storms.
So let's talk a little bit on the flip side, the recovery process, and how states and communities are approaching it now in this current day and age, and how they had in the past, Chad. Each situation is unique. New Orleans, Harvey, even New York's response to Sandy. From your perspective, in the past, did communities, really sort of buckle in from the resiliency standpoint and say, well, we're just going to rebuild here? But now states and cities and towns are really taking a look at those hard-hit areas and saying it makes zero sense to do so. And what are the public policy implications at play with basically just not even the cleanup process, but the wholesale moving of communities into other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think government, historically started with the notion of we're just going to help out, and it was very responsive. It wasn't very proactive. It was always after the event. And we know that today we call it disaster relief, which actually has a political connotation to it, right? It's once you've been declared a disaster, there's a bunch of mechanisms, including financial mechanisms, that open up, taxpayer dollars, money from the federal government to help to sort of deal with the situation. And again, historically, we've been very reactive in our approach. We would just simply come in and help if you remember Governor Christie at the time in 2012 down in New Jersey, you mentioned Superstorm Sandy, walking with President Obama at the time and saying, we will rebuild. That's a mantra. It's a very important mantra culturally that we've inherited.
But is it practical?
Right. So that's historical, and we still continue that today to a degree where we look to remediation. We look to government coming in and stepping in to help make everything okay. One of the problems that we've had is that government, again, historically, has incentivized us living in these coastal areas. It's helped to provide financing for infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, the things that are necessary to really develop communities. It's made it low cost. The fact that we have now today an insurance program, and flood insurance program, that's simply public. It's run by the federal government, and historically the federal government has offered that program at significantly reduced rates, meaning that if you were trying to get private flood insurance from a private insurance company, they charge you a much higher premium, what's called an actuarial rate. All of those things have told people that, look, it's not very risky to live along the coast. And the way that people identify that is, when you go to buy a house on the coastline around here, you ask the realtor, does it have, flood insurance? And they say, yeah, maybe it's required here. But then the realtor says, but it's only $500 a year. And I think the average citizen looks at that and says, $500, that's less than my homeowner's insurance. That's way less than my property taxes. That's just not a lot of risk. So no problem. So my point is that we've done a lot of things that have incentivized people to live in relatively risky areas. We're now looking, if you look at reports, Boston has a Green Ribbon Commission, issued a report a couple of years ago that started looking at proactive measures. And of course, at the federal level, that means some difficult choices about stopping to incentivize infrastructure, the building of infrastructure. I think you mentioned earlier quickly that after Superstorm Sandy in New York City, the government decided to do some buyouts instead of rebuilding in certain areas, very low-lying areas. So these were homes that were destroyed during Sandy, where they decided to simply purchase the land and take it away from development. That's been kind of iffy. They've kind of moved back from that to some degree. We exist in this world where there's ongoing pressures. There's pressures for people, they desire to live along coastal areas. There's high demand, and when the real estate market's doing well and you're in an area of high demand like New York City, where there's limited real estate, often you find that those incentives can somehow, they take over when events like these hurricanes don't happen, every so often. If they're not happening every year, the public kind of sort of, the desire to have government do something proactively sort of, ebbs.
Dissipates, not the flow, certainly the ebb. So we've seen that here in actually Cranston, for instance, in Rhode Island, some buybacks from houses along low-lying river areas that have been prone to excessive flooding. The city stepped in and said, look, these have to go. And what was the pushback and the reticence after New York really took that? As I know you mentioned the ebb and flow, but they'd initially taken that big step and said, okay, we're just going to take these off. What were the set of circumstances?
So, after Superstorm Sandy, there was an area, low-lying areas along the Hudson, where they were sort of, the city basically effectively gave the rights to development to the state, and basically, like open space here, just said, hey, state, take ownership of this and keep it as open space, so that we have this buffer zone. We're going to create the buffer zone that we might not have right now. And that worked out fine. But a few years later, 2015, 2016, as you know, we're in an economic recovery from the Great Recession. Things are going well, real estate values are increasing, and it's getting tight. There's a lot of demand for property along those areas. And of course, this is an area that's highly desirable. It's, it's right near the river, that sort of thing. So the city has requested from the state to give that land back for development purposes. And so I think that's just an example. You can follow that in the news. The New York Times has reported on this pretty well over the years. And again, so you see that kind of, in policy they might talk, they call it, when the public becomes focused on an event, you have what's called a focusing event. So you have something happen, it might be tragic, it might be a hurricane like this, and everybody gets focused in the moment. And that's where you have what's called windows of opportunity. You can actually do something politically that otherwise you might not be able to do. But if that event goes away, maybe some of the public support for it goes away as well.
Then they forget as well. And let's talk a little bit about that, and we'll use the New York example. We see when hurricanes hit, the proximity to the storm and the proximity to the water body, most governmental agencies require evacuations. Is there any way to require, especially let's look at the New York case, kind of a smart rebuild? I'm not saying it's going to look like the Outer Banks, sort of up on the 10-foot pylons there, but is that feasible, and is that something that needs to be considered?
Yeah, so I'm sorry. Yeah, to go back to an earlier part of our discussion, what governments are doing now better today is they're thinking more proactively. And I think your example there is that it's building standards, right? Setback requirements, freeboard they call it. Sometimes you see that where the home is built actually on stilts, whether concrete stilts or things like that. And so these, and there's all kinds of other land use tools, rolling easements, sort of instead of a 30-foot setback, it's a 30-year setback based on sea level rise, the anticipated rise of the ocean, so there's many ways you can incorporate a proactive approach in a sort of land use planning perspective, and those are all really good examples. And I know the federal government now for a number of years has gotten out of the business of providing, zero interest and guarantees and assurities for infrastructure development, the sewers, the lines, that sort of thing, the electric, the grid, in these sensitive areas. So what they're trying to do in that way is say, look, if you're going to develop, the state is going to allow development in a sensitive coastal area, either the private developer or the county or the local government is going to have to flip the bill, right? If the federal government is out of the business of making it easier to do that. So those are all proactive measures.
And let's talk a little bit on the policy side of things. As we're watching Florence and any hurricane that takes place around the country, there's the individuals that evacuate and then there are ones that stay. How much of a cost is it for communities when they literally have to go and rescue folks who have decided to try to ride out the storm for any number of circumstances, but at the opposition to what they've been told by elected officials?
Yeah, I think, I'm not an economist, but I think most economists agree that storm events like this are all cost. And we're not talking simply about human lives, but if you look at, there's always been some anecdotal argument that, when you have a storm like this, there's a lot of rebuilding that happens, and that can spur economic activity. And that's true for certain places, for certain businesses.
But that doesn't offset the cost of the storm by any stretch of the imagination.
No, it doesn't even come close, and that's right. And so I think what you're identifying, at least in my opinion, is additional costs. So there's cost to human life, there's cost to human safety, there's cost to what it takes for those, not only the people that have chosen to stay that need to be rescued, but of course the first responders, those individuals that are putting their lives at risk. We see this, in California, the firefighters, for example, right? I mean, it's not only the cost to the actual the devastation of the natural resources during the fire, for example, but it's the cost of those responders that have to try to, mitigate the effects of it.
And when we see those numbers, Chad, are any time opportunity costs incorporated in there as well? The number of businesses that lose business days, do we ever see those numbers played out?
I mean, so to do an accurate accounting, right, you'd want to list all all of the costs
Yep.
against all of the benefits. You don't want to cherry pick, right? And that's exactly right. So there's significant delay. There's loss in business opportunity. There's all kinds. I mean, there are all kinds of additional costs. I mean, there's people feel uncertain about the area for a period of time. There's lack of investment for those reasons.
Yep.
From that perspective. Yeah. I mean, if it's an area like New Orleans, actually, there's been studies on this. After Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans was already in a strong state of development. It was on the rise, so to speak, from an economic development perspective. And after Katrina, there were certainly costs, without a doubt. And I don't even know if the population today, right, has returned to what
Yep.
the population was. But we know for a very long time that population was significantly less. So all of those things are real costs that are incurred in areas, even areas that are considered viable and areas in demand where people want to move to otherwise, right, want to be around.
So before we let you go, Chad, we were able to, again, talk with the Weather Channel from the forecast perspective. But from your public policy perspective, what are you keeping an eye on in terms of Florence and how its interaction with government?
So it's going to be interesting to see the political response. One of the most difficult things that I think we have to overcome as a nation is we culturally think of land as something that's static, that's just sort of inert, like undeveloped land. We just see it and it doesn't change, and we can count on it to always be that way. And I think we have to shift our thinking, at least in terms of these natural disasters, from land being something that's static to something that's an active thing. It's constantly in change. And it's going to be interesting to see how the government chooses to respond. The political incentives are clear. The studies that have been done on this are quite clear. When the government comes in and distributes financial money directly to the people who have suffered loss, and that's mostly in redevelopment, and small business loans and all kinds of other things, they win votes by doing that. It's very costly for them to do that, but they win votes that way. So it's going to be interesting to see how the politicians and how government choose to respond to this.
Yes.
In terms of, are they going to dole out a lot of sort of after the fact benefits and not think about the proactive aspects that we were talking about earlier.
Well, it's certainly a tug and pull, and clearly there's a lot of human toll at stake. But as you mentioned, economic one as well. And we appreciate being able to pick your brain as we're all focused on the weather to get sort of the response side of things and what to look at moving forward. So Chad McGuire at UMass Dartmouth, thank you so much for taking the time to Skype in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks, Chad. We'll let Chad go, and we'll be right back. Navigant Credit Union.